Hi everyone! So today we're going to be talking all about how to care for the oh so beautiful Philodendron Micans. Now I get more comments about people struggling with this philodendron than any other philodendron. So my hope today is that this video will help you be able to successfully care for these plants moving forward. Now before we get started, I do want to remind people that yes, I know my care guides are a little longer than some other people's, but that's because I really want to make sure you're getting all the information you need to succeed with a plant. However, that being said, I do also timestamp all of my care guides down below so you can quickly hop to the section that you need to reference. And if you need to come back and re-reference at some point, it makes it easier to just get to what you need to re-reference quickly. So always keep that in mind. Now, Philodendron Micans is hands down one of my all-time favorite philodendrons, with those beautiful velvety heart-shaped leaves with those gorgeous red backsides to them. And I especially like it because it can be grown as a trailing plant because those leaves will stay relatively small. Now, the information that I'm going to be sharing with you today actually applies to more philodendrons than just the Philodendron Micans. The scientific name for Philodendron Micans is not actually Philodendron Micans, it is Philodendron Hederaceum, and the variety is just Micans. Philodendron Brazil is another example of a Philodendron Hederaceum, and the variety is just Brazil. So the care information that I'm going to be giving you today is going to apply to pretty much any small heart-shaped leaf philodendron, but there are some specific nuances to the Micans in particular that you're not going to necessarily see happen on some of your other Hederaceum varieties that I will mention as we go along today. Now, these plants are native to Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, and the northern and central parts of South America, meaning they're used to a very tropical environment. However, I have found that Philodendron Micans and other Philodendron Hederaceum varieties have done perfectly fine in my non-tropical conditions in my home, which is another reason that I absolutely adore these plants. Now, as far as the growth pattern goes for them, you can grow them either as trailing plants, which is my personal preference, or as climbers. But in the wild, they are epiphytic in nature, and more specifically, they are what are known as secondary hemiepiphytes, meaning that they start growing rooted into the forest floor, and then they climb up trees. Now, I do want to take a moment to explain epiphytes to you guys a little more because I've been noticing some people have some confusion on this topic. So epiphyte is the broad umbrella term here. Underneath that broad umbrella term, you have hollow epiphytes, which are plants that never grow roots in the ground at all. So think orchids, for example, or your staghorn ferns. They root in the canopy of a tree, and that is where they live their entire life. Now, beyond that, you have what are known as hemiepiphytes. As I just described, our Philodendron Micans is a hemiepiphyte. However, underneath hemiepiphytes, it is broken down into two more categories. So hemiepiphytes just means that at some point the plant does root into the ground. As I just stated, this is a secondary epiphytic plant, meaning that it starts rooting into the ground and then goes up the tree. Primary hemiepiphytes do the exact opposite. They start in the tree canopy and then they send their roots down to root into the ground. Now, another thing to note with hemiepiphytes, especially secondary ones, is that at some point, your Philodendron Micans, if it's living in the wild, will climb up a tree and it may choose to sever its roots from the ground and live as a hollow epiphyte at that point. However, it still would technically be referred to as a secondary hemiepiphyte because it did originally start rooting in the forest floor. Now, those same types of plants can also choose to send their roots back down into the ground, but really it's just about how does that plant start its journey that determines what kind of epiphyte it is. Now, Philodendron Micans, in my experience, has been a very fast-growing plant. I originally bought mine when it was just a little 3.5-inch baby, not trailing hardly at all, and it took off rapidly. It is currently in a 6-inch pot. I have propagated this thing more times than I can count. It just grows incredibly quickly for me, but I am giving it fairly ideal conditions. So let's start getting into the best conditions for these plants. So starting with light. This is a plant that does well in what I would describe as medium indirect light. I would caution you on getting this into super high indirect light. Can it tolerate it? Yes, but one of the things that you will start to notice is that your leaves are going to get lighter. And if you're like me, one of the things I love about this plant is that it has these darker green velvety leaves, but the more light you give it, the lighter that shade of green is going to get. Now, I would caution you not to put this into a low light situation. Yes, you will get super dark green leaves, but these plants can get leggy very fast, meaning that the space between each node can become exaggerated and excessively long when you get this plant in a lower light condition. So I really recommend medium light at the lowest, medium to high at the highest. Unless you're okay with those leaves being a bit less dark, then you could go with a higher amount of indirect light. Now, what I mean by indirect light is you really don't want direct sun rays hitting the leaves of this plant for an extended period of time. If you were, for example, to put this in an east-facing window, it would be getting some direct light rays early in the morning, but that's usually when the sun's not very intense yet, and as long as it's not for more than an hour or so, you should be okay. Where mine currently lives, it's been living there for most of its life that I've had it, is on a shelf behind my couch, fairly far back from some southern-facing windows, so it rarely gets any direct rays of sunlight on it. This time of year, it gets none because the sun is tracking more north in the sky. Quick reminder that I am in the northern hemisphere, so if you're in the southern hemisphere, this would be the equivalent of your plant being in a north-facing window. But in the winter, when the sun is tracking more southerly in the sky, occasionally a few rays of light can reach this plant, but it is so far back from my southern-facing window, we're talking probably at least 10 feet, that I don't really have to worry about it scorching the leaves. Now let's talk about soil real quick, because this is one plant where I feel like it can actually thrive in a good variety of types of substrates. Normally, for most philodendron, I would recommend using my epiphyte mix, and if you're not familiar with my soil mixes, I will place a link in the description below for you to my video where I talk all about that. But I have found that this plant does well in almost every mix that I use, minus cacti and succulent soil, because I just would never use that for this. But the mix it was in when I bought it was very similar to my basic mix, and it thrived in that, so I didn't repot it for a long time, and it did great in that mix. It is now in my epiphyte mix, and it has done well in that as well. But the fact that it did well in both of those kinds of substrates tells me that it would probably also do equally as well in my forest floor mix. So you might be wondering, well, how the heck do I determine what kind of substrate to put it into? My recommendation here is to actually determine your substrate for this plant based on your watering habits and the lighting conditions that you have the plant in. So let me explain. If you have this plant in ideal lighting conditions, it should use up its water quickly enough in any of those substrates for it not to potentially be sitting there wet for too long and running the risk of getting something such as root rot. So if you do have your plant in a slightly less ideal lighting situation, moving more towards a low light situation, then I would definitely recommend not going with the basic mix, because it is going to stay wet longer than my forest floor mix and my epiphyte mix. Similarly, if you are somebody who is prone to overwatering, I would not put it in the basic mix for the same reason. It's going to stay wet longer. You're going to be increasing your likelihood of getting root rot if you're watering too frequently. If you are somebody who is severely prone to underwatering, then yes, I would probably recommend going with the forest floor mix or the basic mix, because that epiphyte mix, you're really going to have to stay on top of watering this plant when it's in an epiphyte mix. Now, that being said, how should we handle letting this plant dry out? How much does it want to dry out? I used to be of the mindset when I first got into plants that philodendron, because they were epiphytic, wanted to dry all the way out between waterings. That is true of some philodendron, but with Philodendron Micans and other Philodendron Hederaceum varieties, I have found that they really don't like to dry all the way out. You're going to get leaf loss almost instantaneously when you let them dry all the way out. So I try to water them when they're still about approximately quarter of the way still damp. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we are looking at my Philodendron Micans pot here, when this soil started to look pretty dried out to about this point right here, that's when I would go in and water it, which it needs watering right now. It's actually probably a little bit past that point. I can also tell because it is definitely super light compared to what it is right after I water it. So it definitely needs it. Now, if you do go too far beyond watering on your Philodendron Micans, I want to point out something that is different from your other Philodendron Hederaceum. On your other Philodendron Hederaceum, your leaves will do what most plants' leaves do. They will start to turn yellow, dry up, and die off. However, on Philodendron Micans, more often than not, your leaves will turn red before they start to die. Let me get this out of the way so I can hopefully show you one of these red leaves right here. So this is what will happen. Your leaves will start to turn a shade of red and then they will kind of crisp up and die off. This reddish coloring, remember that, because that can also be caused by some other things that we're going to be talking about here in a bit. Now, as far as temperature range goes for these plants, their ideal temperature range is going to be somewhere between 65 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, that is not to say that they cannot tolerate temperatures outside of that range. That is just the ideal range. If you want ideal growth on your plant, do not let it get below that 65 marker and don't let it get crazy high above 80. They can, once again, survive in temperatures that are higher than that, but we're talking ideal situations here. And if you are growing this in your home, I don't know many people who keep their thermostat at higher than 80 in their home anyway, so you should be perfectly fine. But quick reminder, also make sure that you don't have your plant directly under a vent where it's going to be getting a very cold draft of air if you have AC running, or a very hot draft of air if you have your heat running. Now, I want to take a moment to talk about dormancy and slowed growth, because a lot of people incorrectly think that every plant goes dormant in the winter, which doesn't really make sense because these plants are growing inside of your house and they don't necessarily know that the season has changed. However, if you do let the temperature get too low for your plant, for example, let's say your HVAC system goes out in the middle of the night in the dead of winter and you wake up and it's like 50 degrees in your house, do not be surprised if your plant goes through a bit of shock and stops growing. That is something that can induce dormancy in your Philodendron Micans or pretty much any plant in your home. But if you're keeping your home within that 65 to 80 degree temperature range, then 9 times out of 10, you're not going to see your plant go through a dormancy phase. It's typically not going to slow down a lot in growth. The only reason it might slow down in growth has to do with the fact that you're going to be getting less hours of daylight in each day in the winter than you would in the summer, for example. Now, as far as humidity goes, like I stated at the beginning of this video, they're from very tropical climates. They're used to high humidity, but mine have all done fine in ambient. My Micans, a lot of people think like because the Micans has the very velvety leaves on it, that it is going to struggle massively with too low of humidity. I have not had that problem on this plant, you guys. The leaves are doing absolutely fine. I never get any kind of crisping. I honestly never get any kind of yellowing really until the leaf starts to die and does that red thing I showed you earlier. And then it just quickly goes to yellow and crisps up. But I just don't have like yellow spots, anything like that, that a lot of people associate with lower humidity. And on average, it just depends on the time of year, but I range somewhere between like low 30% humidity in my house up to maybe 60s, low 60s, depending on the time of year. So this plant gets a range, but it never actually gets to the level of humidity that it would be getting in its native environment, and it has done absolutely fine with that. Now, since I did just bring up those red colored leaves again, let's talk about some other situations that can cause you to see that on your plant. First of all, if your plant is in too bright of lighting, that can lead to an increased number of those red leaves. So if you have recently relocated your plant to a slightly brighter location and you start to see an increase in number of red leaves like that, that's a good indicator that that might be a little bit too high a level of light, and maybe you want to move your plant a little further back from the window or to a different location. Now, the other thing that can cause that reddish coloring on those leaves can be a nutrient deficiency. However, this is pretty slim as long as you are fertilizing your plant on a regular basis. So let's talk about fertilization next. I have always used a balanced fertilizer for my Philodendron Micans as well as my other Philodendron Hederaceum varieties. And by balanced, I mean a fertilizer that is a 10-10-10 or a 20-20-20 in terms of NPK, which is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Currently, I have been using Jack's All-Purpose Fertilizer, which is a granular fertilizer that you just mix into your watering can. I recommend watering your plants at least once a month with a fertilizer. Some people prefer to do it once every watering, basically. I think that's a bit much. It's not necessary. And you want to be able to have flushes in between your fertilizing at some point to get excess salt buildups from your fertilizer out of your plant, because if you don't, it can cause what's known as nutrient lockout. And I'm not going to go any more into that in this video because that is a whole nother topic. I do have a separate video on fertilizing that I can link down below in the description for you too if you want to go into a deep dive on that. Now let's talk about the least fun part of every care guide I do, and that is pest and disease. So I hate to break it to you, but just like any houseplant you own, Philodendron Micans or any other Hederaceum variety can be prone to pests. The number one pest that you are most likely to see on your Philodendron Micans is probably spider mites, followed closely by mealybugs. That is not to say that you cannot have thrips. That is not to say that you cannot have aphids or scale on your plant. It's just more common to see spider mites or mealybugs on these plants than any other pest. Now, as always, prevention is key here. I highly recommend doing preventive treatments on your plants at least once a month with a spray of your choice. If you want to use beneficial bugs, that is also another option that you could choose. However, always make sure every time that you're watering your plant that you are carefully inspecting it for pests so that you can catch any kind of problem as early as possible. It will save you a whole headache in terms of trying to resolve the issue if you catch it early. Now, as far as diseases go, the odds of you having a disease issue on your Philodendron Micans growing it in your home is pretty slim. The number one thing that you would potentially see is some kind of fungal issue, but that's only going to happen if, for example, you have your plant packed in tight with a bunch of other plants in an area where the plants themselves are really creating a high amount of humidity, or if you live in a highly humid area and the plant is just constantly in a like 80% or higher state of humidity and you don't have good airflow, that could potentially lead to fungal or like powdery mildew, those kinds of issues on your plant. And increasing airflow is the number one way to avoid this problem. But when I say increasing airflow, I do not mean put the plant underneath your AC vent, because like I mentioned earlier, we don't want those direct AC or heat drafts on our plant. What I mean is just make sure you have a fan running in general to circulate air and kind of disperse humidity in the room where your plant is living. So for example, if my Philodendron Micans was living back here and I lived in a super humid environment, and let's say this whole shelf was filled with plants all around it, then I would want to make sure that I am running my ceiling fan above me throughout the day to help keep good airflow in this room and break up some of that humidity. Now, since one of my cute little fur babies did just wander in here while I'm filming this video, let me take this opportunity to let you know that Philodendron Micans, as well as other Philodendron Hederaceum varieties, are all toxic to humans and pets. So if you do have a pet that is prone to nibbling on your plants, definitely make sure you keep this plant out of their reach. Now let's talk about propagating next. These plants are super easy to propagate. Regardless of whether you have it trailing or climbing, you can always just cut directly below a node, pop them into some water, and they will root up very easily. I actually have some here that honestly I probably should have potted up way sooner than now because they definitely have plenty of roots. But once they are at this stage, you can definitely just pot them up, create a whole nother plant, or if you want to, you can do what I have done in mine recently, which is take some of my propagations and I potted them back up on this side of the pot because at the time that I repotted this, all of the vines kind of got squished together because I changed the substrate to my epiphyte mix. And so I wanted to get a more full looking plant up here on this side. So I just stuck some of the rooted propagations down in here. But speaking of repotting, I do recommend checking these plants once a year just to see how root bound they've gotten and determine if they need to be repotted. Mine honestly has been able to go approximately every 2 years without needing to be repotted, but that is largely going to depend on the conditions that your plant is living in. If I had mine, for example, a little bit closer to that southern facing window, it might be growing a little bit more rapidly, it might get root bound a little bit more quickly, and I might need to repot it more frequently. So it really just depends, but check it once a year just to see. Definitely wait till it is totally root bound, and then make sure you're only going up 1 pot size larger when you repot it. But there you have it. That is how I care for all of my Philodendron Hederaceum, including my Philodendron Micans. This really is a rewarding plant. If you have struggled with it in the past, hopefully this video has helped you out. But if you do have any additional questions, feel free to comment down below. And if you have enjoyed this video and found it useful today, please be sure to click that like and/or subscribe button. And I look forward to seeing you again next time. Aloha!